Alright, so the brachial plexus. Let me start off by saying that even though this is mainly a memorization task, I think I can cut down the time taken for you to get this down simply by choosing the order of information I give you. I'll also point out some observations that will help you memorize the branches of the plexus. The way I want you to picture the plexus for now is as a main framework, giving main branches and other small branches. I'll discuss this later on. First, I'll start off with the roots of the plexus because they're the starting points, and we gotta start somewhere. Alright, so what are the roots of the brachial plexus? What does C5, C6, C7, C8, what do they represent? So to start off, let's just discuss the spinal cord real quick. So this oval mess right here is the spinal cord. The spinal cord has two sides. There's the left and the right side. They are both the same. So what happens on the left side happens on the right side. So you have two brachial plexuses, one for your left upper limb and one for your right upper limb. Alright, so one thing I want to point out is that like this almost semicircle smooth structure that projects towards the ventral side of the body, or the anterior or the front side of the body, and the transverse processes and there are other stuff as well, they project towards the posterior side of the body or the dorsal side of the body. So this would be the dorsal root and this would be the ventral root of the spinal nerve. By the way, when I say this, I mean what I'm pointing out with my mouse right now, so please follow that if you're not. When textbooks say, or when people say the spinal nerve comes out the spinal cord out of two roots, that's not entirely true, because what actually happens is that it comes out the spinal cord out of the ventral root, because the ventral root carries motor neurons, and it goes into the spinal cord with the dorsal root, because the dorsal root only carries sensory neurons. So this goes in and this goes out, right? So, and the spinal nerve carries both sensory and motor neurons, so it carries neurons carrying impulses in two opposite directions. Alright, so the spinal nerve is the collection of both sensory and motor neurons. So what the spinal cord splits into are called rami. There's the ventral rami and the dorsal rami. They are called primary rami. And there are two like small rami right here, but like they are irrelevant when you're talking about the brachial plexus. So actually the roots of the brachial plexus are the ventral rami of the spinal nerves. So another demonstration of what I just said is this. I find it really helpful. This is the spinal nerve. It contains both sensory and motor neurons. So the motor neurons are the red colored lines, and the sensory neurons are the blue colored lines. The motor neurons come out the ventral root, and the sensory neurons go in the dorsal root. There are two primary rami, the ventral and the ventral rami, the dorsal rami, and the two small ones. They carry mixed neurons, carrying impulses in both directions. One last thing I want to point out is the naming of the spinal nerves. So it's actually different for cervical spinal nerves and the thoracic spinal nerves. One thing you might have heard is that there are eight cervical spinal nerves, and there's only 7 cervical vertebral bones. If you can see in this picture, this is the vertebral bone C1, and above it is the C1 spinal nerve, and this is the vertebral bone C2, and above it is the spinal nerve C2, and this carries on till C7. Vertebral bone C7, which is the last cervical vertebral bone, has the spinal nerve C7 above it, which is the last, which is not the last spinal nerve, because below the vertebral bone C7 is the spinal nerve C8, right? And this is the last spinal nerve. So there's one more spinal nerve. There's one more. My bad. So this is the last cervical spinal nerve, and there is one more cervical spinal nerve. Then there is cervical vertebral bone T1 onwards, or the thoracic vertebral bone onwards. The thoracic spinal nerves exist below the thoracic bone, or the thoracic vertebral bone. So T1 will have the T1 spinal nerves below it, and T2 will have the T2 spinal nerve below it. Alright, so for the roots of the plexus, one way to go about remembering them is knowing there are 5 roots and that they end with T1, the first thoracic nerve. Knowing that, you can always start with T1 and go backwards to get the other 4 roots. You can also know there are 5 roots and they start with C5. So the roots of the plexus are C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. Alright, so I have absolutely magnificently drawn the framework of the brachial plexus. Big words right there. It's not very neat, but trust me, it will get the job done, right? So there are, like we said, there are 5 roots of the brachial plexus. These lines, these brown lines, they divide the framework into 4 regions. These are the roots, these are the trunks, these are the divisions, and these are the chords, right? So let's take this step by step, right? So the roots, the upper 2 roots combine to form the upper trunk. The middle root goes on to form the middle trunk, and the lower 2 roots combine to form the lower trunk. Okay, so I want you to like imagine this. These are in your neck, right? These 2 roots. So C6 goes up and C5 goes down. They form the upper trunk. They combine together and they form the upper trunk. I want you guys to imagine this as this goes on. All right. So this another thing I want you guys to imagine is that if something comes out of the spinal cord above something else, it will be more lateral. It will come out and will be more lateral to it. All right. So again, it's called the upper, middle, and lower trunk, but I want you guys to also remember that the upper trunk is more lateral to the middle trunk, which is more lateral to the lower trunk, right? Again, let's recap. The C5, C6 roots combine to form the upper trunk, which is more lateral to the rest. The C7 root goes on to form the middle trunk, and the C8 and T1 roots combine to form the lower trunk, right? Now all the trunks divide to give anterior and posterior divisions, and this happens behind your clavicle. All right. So all the trunks divide to give anterior and posterior divisions. Now all the posterior divisions, now we're moving on from divisions into chords, right? So we went through roots, we went through trunks, and we went through divisions, right? The divisions only exist behind your clavicle, and then they just they combine together to form other stuff, right? So all the posterior divisions form the posterior chord of the brachial plexus. The anterior division of the lower trunk forms the medial chord of the brachial plexus, because remember, the lower trunk is the most medial trunk, right? So obviously its anterior division will form the medial chord, right? And the anterior divisions of the upper and the middle trunk combine to form the lateral chord of the brachial plexus. Easy way, or I guess a way you wanna remember this, is that first combination happens of roots into trunks, and then division happens from trunks into divisions, and then combination again happens from divisions into chords, right? Alright, so with that being said, let's now discuss the branches of the brachial plexus. If you remember at the very beginning, I said something about main branches and smaller branches. All right. So the way you wanna think about main branches is, so you see the lateral chord, for example. So you wanna think of the lateral chord giving smaller branches, and what's left, you wanna imagine that as the main branch of the lateral chord, right? The posterior chord will also give smaller branches, and what's left will be the main branch of the posterior chord. And the same thing with the medial chord, alright? So that's what I meant by main branches and smaller branches. So what is the main branch of the lateral chord? Okay, so before I get into this, I'll say there are actually 5 main branches of the brachial plexus, but as you can see there are only 3 chords. So how come there are 5 main branches? Well, let's get into it. Type the main branch of the lateral chord. If I can, yep, it's called the musculocutaneous nerve. There is no way around memorizing the names of the nerves. Obviously I cannot like simplify that. Lateral chord's main branch is the musculocutaneous nerve, and the medial chord's main branch is called the ulnar nerve. Posterior chord, however, it gives 2 main branches. It gives 2 main branches. They are called, if I can find this and change the color, they are called the axillary nerve and the radial nerve. Again, you really just have to memorize these names because that's all there is to it. Okay, so I did say there are 5 main branches, but now even with the division of the posterior cord, we can only see 4 main branches, right? What does that mean? Well, the 5th last main branch is actually through the combination of both the lateral cord and the medial cord. They both give the lateral root and the medial root of the median nerve with an N. Alright, so now we can see all the 5 main branches of the brachial plexus.